also being recorded to be shared with everyone soon. It is an event that we thought we'd start at the press to mark the publication of new books, and specifically books in the series that publishes scholarship that addresses issues of broad societal interest and urgency, and an event that I hope will become a tradition and continue for years to come, whether we do it online or together. So it's been about a year and a half since, together with Kate Marshall, we took over the editorship of the California series in public anthropology, a series that was started by Rob Borowski and Naomi Schneider, and a series that published some of the most influential books in the field by scholars who seek to make their research useful for critically thinking about social problems. And some of the thematic strengths of the series that have emerged through the years include social inequality, violence, global health, and migration. But much more than a shared set of issues, the collection is held together by the way authors understand the aim of ethnography and how they approach writing, and their shared commitment to intervene in public debates. I often like to quote Wole Soyinka, the Nobel Prize in Literature winner in 1986, who said, "A book, if necessary, should be a hammer, a hand grenade which you detonate under a stagnant way of looking at the world." So his words express my vision for the series, and the four authors of new books in public anthropology who are here with us today do just that. And before I go ahead and introduce the authors, I want to welcome the co-editor of the series, the anthropology editor at UC Press, Kate, who just experienced a power outage at home and is joining us via the phone. Hi, Kate.
Hi, welcome everyone.
Great to have you. Okay, so I'll be introducing the authors in order in which their books were released, and also in order in which they will be presenting and reading from them. And then each author will take about 8 to 10 minutes to share their work. And after the presentations, we will have a Q&A. You can submit questions using the Q&A function, as well as the chat function on Zoom, or through Twitter and Facebook Live as well. I will collect them then. Okay, so here's this afternoon's or evening's lineup of speakers. Noelle Stout is the author of Dispossessed. She's a faculty member in the program in advanced teaching and research at Apple University, and she was formerly an associate professor of anthropology at NYU. The research and writing of Dispossessed, here it is, was supported by fellowships from the National Science Foundation, the ACLS, and the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. Kimberly Sue, the author of Getting Wrecked, is an addiction physician and an anthropologist. She's the medical director of the Harm Reduction Coalition, a national advocacy and capacity building organization that promotes the health and dignity of individuals and communities impacted by drug use and the racialized war on drugs. Scott Stonington, the author of Spirit Ambulance, is a practicing primary care and hospital physician. He has written about the social and emotional cognition of health providers, from doctors' emotions and pain management negotiations to jazz-like improvisation in the intensive care unit. He's also lead editor of the New England Journal of Medicine series, Case Studies in Social Medicine. He's currently assistant professor of anthropology and medicine at the University of Michigan. And last but not least, David Vine is the author of just released United States of War, which is his third book in a trilogy about war and peace. The other books include Base Nation, How US Military Bases Abroad Harm America, and the World and Island of Shame, the secret history of the military base on Diego Garcia. Sorry. David is professor of anthropology at American University. He's also a board member of the Costs of War Project and the co-founder of the Overseas Base Realignment and Closure Coalition. So without further ado, I cede the floor to the authors, starting with Noelle. Remember, you can submit your questions throughout the event. I'll be monitoring the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you so much for organizing this event. I'm really delighted to be here and in such good company. It's like a salon, which is so nice to have in these virtual times. So all of these books, I think, are really excellent examples of the power of social science to really intervene in issues of really great public importance. So it's really exciting to see this happening and all the work you're doing at UC Press, both you and Kate. So we've all been asked to read an excerpt from our books, and I've selected a section I'll share in a moment. But first, I just wanted to give a little context for Dispossessed in my research. So Dispossessed tells a story of how in the aftermath of the 2008 US foreclosure crisis, corporate banks erected Kafkaesque bureaucracies that really undermined their promise to deliver aid and assistance to struggling homeowners. Two of the grand kind of overarching themes of the book that I focus on are what I call predatory bureaucracy, and then the decline of the American middle class. And both of these arguments are really grounded in ethnography. So in terms of methods, I spent 2 years in the hard-hit Sacramento Valley, really following and spending a lot of time with homeowners who were struggling to secure government-mandated mortgage assistance, and then also with the bank employees who were processing their appeals on behalf of corporate lenders, and then tasked with the horrible reality of having to deny most of them assistance and aid. So the program that they were working within was called HAMP, the Home Affordable Modification Program. And in 2009, the government launched HAMP to try to quell what was becoming a real tidal wave of foreclosures across the nation, something that we might be seeing shortly, unfortunately. So, but the problem with these programs was that they funneled funds through Wall Street banks. So lenders like Bank of America or Wells Fargo were tasked with administering aid to homeowners. So these corporate lenders oftentimes denied them assistance, and they trapped them in these horrible bureaucracies where there was just, so much misinformation and mismanagement and fraud, and homeowners couldn't access the help even if they qualified. So between 2009 and 2015, just to give you an example, 70% of these homeowner applicants were denied assistance. So that means that 9 million homeowners who wanted to stay in their homes and continued to pay on their mortgages faced eviction. The failures of these programs were shrouded in a discourse of error, bureaucratic snafu, but these so-called mistakes of corporate lenders only worked in favor of the lenders. They never, for instance, magically erased the debts of homeowners or calculated errors in favor of homeowners. And one important point is that there were other options. During the Great Depression, the government had taken on the toxic mortgages and debts of Americans, but during the 2008 depression or Great Recession, federal mortgage assistance was outsourced to Wall Street institutions. And I can talk more about this privatization of aid. I had an opportunity to chat with Timothy Geithner about this, and some of that ended up in the book. So I'm happy to go into that in the Q&A if people are interested. So the heart of the book is understanding really what developed as what I call predatory bureaucracy, which is the other end of predatory finance. And so we have techniques that extract profits and then conceal those goals within a facade of assistance and private sector efficiency. So it wasn't simply the foreclosures alone that sent people into desperation and divorce and despair. It was also the experience of consistently facing these nonsensical bureaucratic roadblocks that really triggered what I saw as unnecessary suffering. So I'm just going to read a few pages. And just a note that I had to change the names of the corporate lenders. So the banks are, you probably won't recognize them, but they are your typical corporate banks. So this is from chapter 3, robbing Peter to pay Paul, relocating the middle class. Page 101 for those of you who are interested in following along. What began in 2006 as a concentration of mortgage defaults in Oak Park, Sacramento's poorest neighborhood, had spread by 2008 to traditionally lower middle class and middle class areas, plunging the Sacramento Valley into an economic recession. Government workers confronted furloughs, and the mortgage and construction industries collapsed. Local businesses shuttered their doors and unemployment soared across the region. Property values plummeted. It was during this dismal season that David Sanchez, the Chicano veteran who I introduced in the introduction, who had purchased a dream home with his wife, Karen, after she had survived her cancer treatment, was laid off from his job as a video technician at a local public college in 2009. Just 2 months after David was laid off, they found out that Karen's cancer had progressed. The cost of restarting Karen's cancer treatments left them unable to pay their mortgage. And so this is exactly the kind of couple that should qualify for mortgage assistance under HAMP's rules. The couple approached Leviathan Bank, which is a pseudonym, for a federally sponsored HAMP modification. As required, they faxed their documents, and the documents were always so cumbersome. An intake form requiring information about monthly expenses and debts, cash on hand and credit card spending, a hardship letter, a tax authorization form, recent pay stubs that showed year-to-date earnings, a statement of Social Security and unemployment benefits, multiple bank statements, and federal tax returns. And all of the forms had to be faxed, they couldn't be emailed. But Leviathan lost their paperwork 4 times, each time telling them they would have to reapply. Once the application was finally recognized, the service representative explained that David and Karen had to be 3 months behind on their mortgage in order to qualify for a modification. I had never been behind, David told me, and that just really threw me for a loop. But at the time, my wife was getting really sick, having a real difficult time, and we could see that our funds were going to dwindle. They halted payments and waited for a response from the Leviathan Bank. Then Karen's health insurance through her job at the college fell through. One of Karen's doctors had checked the wrong box on a form qualifying Karen to return to work, although she was in the middle of intensive chemotherapy. Because of the mistake, Karen lost her health insurance temporarily, and the couple had to come up with an extra $800 a month to cover her cancer treatments. They had to hire a lawyer to reinstate her coverage, but the process took months. While battling the health insurance company and the teachers' union over Karen's coverage, David also spent hours on the phone each week trying to get an answer from Leviathan Bank about their modification. He told me back and forth at the bank. It got to the point you just don't want to talk on the phone. You call up and try to talk to someone, and you talk to some young lady that's still playing with Barbies. She doesn't understand a thing. And she says, "Sir, we need a payment. We need a payment. Okay, call me when you get your braces off and you can talk." David tried other avenues to secure mortgage assistance, including nonprofits that assisted homeowners in the modification process, to no avail. He told me, "You go to Save Your Home California and they say, we're here to help you. We have to look at your finances and look at what you eat and what you drink and whether or not you smoke and if you pay for insurance. Do you have animals? Do you have private loans with other people? Are your pets vaccinated?" And you get a letter from a forum that they're going to answer some questions and give you some facts, and it's always like 400 miles away. I'd called all these programs and they were roadblocks. The programs were set up for people that were not behind. After faxing reams of paperwork and spending months navigating Leviathan Bank's Byzantine bureaucracy, David and Karen were enrolled in a trial modification plan, which promised to deliver a final decision regarding their modification after 3 months of reduced payment. So they pay into it, and in 3 months, they'll know whether or not they receive assistance. But they paid into the trial modification for nearly a year, which was illegal by the terms of set by the federal government. So they paid into the modification for a year, submitting monthly financial statements along with their payments. But after that year, a Leviathan representative told David that the investor who actually held the mortgage would not accept the terms of the modification. Leviathan had never had the final authority to approve their application in the first place. Karen passed away 3 weeks later. 2 days after she died, David found a foreclosure notice from Leviathan in his mailbox. Desperate and depressed, David tried going back to Leviathan to appeal his denial. One mortgage modification specialist said they could potentially lower his payments, but Karen would have to sign off on the agreement. "My wife is dead, and you guys still haven't recognized that," David said, his voice cracking. "That's the hardship, the entire reason I need the help." That was the moment David gave up. Quote, "I crawled into my little cave," he told me, "and then basically I was alone and I didn't care." David's mortgage modification denial and subsequent foreclosure after protracted struggle with Leviathan Bank compounded the devastating loss of his wife. Foreclosure notices burned like personal betrayals exceeding the boundaries of a financial contract gone awry. Leviathan's failure to recognize Karen's death felt to David like an intimate disloyalty after years of disregard. Because of the abuses by Leviathan, David had been forced to spend the last months of Karen's life on hold with service representatives and running to Kinko's to fax paperwork. The fight to save his home divided his attention at a time when Karen had needed him most. While devastating, David's foreclosure was unfortunately predictable. The odds were stacked against him. Decades of neoliberal restructuring, had left David as a temporary employee at the college, the first category of staff to be laid off during a downturn. Even before the financial crisis, David would have been vulnerable after Karen's death because households headed by a widow were twice as likely as households of married couples to struggle to pay their mortgages, even after controlling for income and wealth. As a Latino borrower, David was more likely to receive a subprime loan and less likely to receive a mortgage modification. Perhaps worst of all, he was combating Leviathan, which was notorious for its mortgage modification abuses. Kafkaesque journeys through corporate administration show how the mortgage assistance application process continued legacies of deindustrialization, discrimination, and the stagnation of wages, cementing the dissolution of post-war American middle-class aspirations in the process. Entanglements with mortgage modification bureaucracies define the foreclosure experiences of many Sacramento Valley residents. Customer service representatives at major lenders implementing HAMP stranded homeowners on hold and denied them mortgage assistance even when they qualified. Lenders moved forward with foreclosures while homeowners were stuck in modification applications, which is an illegal practice known as dual tracking. People described being ensnared in a dysfunctional system riddled with misinformation and mismanagement. Even worse was the common feeling that lenders were, quote, lying, cheating, and trying to force homeowners to give up. Mortgage assistance programs were promoted as helping Americans maintain middle-class lifestyles and aspirations. Ads for mortgage assistance, for example, suggested that mortgage modifications would protect families and safeguard marriages, keeping worthy middle-class citizens in their picket-fenced homes. But the very act of submitting to the scrutiny and Byzantine runarounds demanded by corporate lenders undermined applicants' already tenuous hold on middle-class status, disrupting forms of social capital that had defined them. Stonewalled by mainstream financial lenders, homeowners were hard-pressed to recognize that their own downward mobility had become the new normal. I'll stop here and just say that these lessons about the failures to address the needs of working families in California are all the more critical today when we're facing another more intense economic downturn and another wave of evictions and foreclosures. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Noelle. It's really important research. And I look forward to actually reading your book soon. Thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful event featuring so many great authors. Thanks for all your hard work organizing this. So I'm happy to talk about my book, Getting Wrecked, Women Incarceration in the American Opioid Crisis. So a little bit of background about the book. So the book came out last year. Honestly, with COVID, it's like, when did it come out? It's been a little bit of a whirlwind. You know, it's really hard, I think, for a book to come out during such a worldwide disruption. I think I had given a couple book talks in the fall of last year and early January, and really everything was cut short at that point in March. So a little bit about the book. I'm a physician and anthropologist, and I had always really been, I was in Massachusetts at Harvard Medical School doing my medical training, and I had always been thinking about especially what the Public Anthropology series really tries to do, which is how can I work on a subject that really has significant relevance to our contemporary problems that we have in the United States and around the world. And I had been doing research in some anthropology research in the lived experiences of people with HIV, and really thinking about ways, and that led me to incarceration. So that led me to prisons and jails, which in the United States, I would argue is one of the most pressing systems of racialized and criminalized injustice that we are dealing with currently. And so I really wanted to figure out a way that we could use anthropology as a lens, the way that I could think critically about medicine and its role in these systems. And one thing I kept coming back to was the role of the criminal justice system, so to speak, or what I call the carceral system, which I think is a better term actually for what is going on. the carceral therapeutic state in my book, is really like, why do we send so many people with substance use disorders to prison and jail? And that, as a doctor, that didn't make sense to me. And, just as a human being, that also morally didn't necessarily make sense to me. So it's much more than substance use disorders, honestly. There's a huge net of things, basically, that I think are really important in contemporary discourse, like selling drugs, having naloxone, for example, to reverse an overdose. Someone called Child Protective Services on someone recently for that. So there's this wide net that includes, quote unquote paraphernalia, and it's a racialized system of policing and surveillance. So I decided, there are some advantages maybe Scott and I can talk about to having sort of this dual identity as a physician and training as an anthropologist. So with that, I was able to construct a study in which I would be in and out of prisons and jails and also in the community. And I was also developing an interest in becoming an addiction physician. And as an anthropologist, it's quite an interesting nexus. It's really an interesting place to be, because the stories of why people use drugs, what drugs they use, how they like to use them, where they like to use them, people, places, things, setting, history, family, trauma, genetics. It's just really a right place for an anthropologist. And as a clinician, I was finding that so much of, there are certain things they could do with medicines, but it really was about all this other stuff, which is, and for everyone it's different. And that was what was really fascinating for me. So I set to do research in the US. So I did my research in Boston. I had also explored doing research in Philly or doing research in Chicago. And I really thought, we need to I feel like it's important for me to do ethnography where I live. And I really think that we should, find ways that we can fund this and we can fuel, doing ethnography where we are. So I set about to do this quite difficult study involving multiple IRBs at different prisons and jails, and really looking at, the lived experiences of women with opioid use disorder, primarily heroin in Massachusetts, and thinking about how their experiences in the prison system, in the prison and jail system, actually really set them up for harm, suffering, and frankly, death. We know that people who are incarcerated, much like people who are experiencing homelessness, really die at really abysmally young. And, really their lives are cut short. And for a variety of reasons, not just substance use. And so I was very interested in this. And that's where the book came from. So, it's very interesting thinking about the book in the context of COVID, actually, and we can talk a little bit about in the Q&A, some of my work as a doctor at Rikers Island in New York City, and the ways that these existing things that I've been working on and studying, these structural inequalities, the structural racism, have really played out in our pandemic and really played out around the carceral state as well. And thinking about how, for example, compassionate release, there's not even medical indications. They won't, some places won't even accept, medical indications for that. And so there's, it's a fascinating system, and one that I think COVID has allowed us the possibility. There's these like glimmers of where things don't really align. And that is where I think, having this ethnographic lens, having this social science and this history lens, this deep process can allow us to think about, okay, so like, why do we do things that way? In addiction, we're like, oh, the DEA, okay, you can prescribe doing the telephone, like, that's fine. Why did we ever do it before, where you had to spend 8 hours coming to see me every week? And so trying to realize that a lot of this stuff actually could dissolve. So I'm going to read a little bit from this book, which I'm reading from chapter 7, Life and Death After Jail. And I'll just get started. Shooting intravenous drugs means you might die at any moment. Every time you load a needle, try to find a vein that isn't collapsed or shrunken into itself, draw the plunger back, check for blood, and release the drugs that you've acquired on the street into your vein. There is that risk that you might die in 10 minutes, 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week. The drugs might be bad. I'm sorry. The drugs might be bad, either too strong or cut with some strange substance you didn't expect to be there. They could contain rat poisoning, embalming fluid, or fentanyl. There is a risk that your needle or simply your skin or the water used to cook your drugs carries some bacteria that finds easy passage to the valves in your heart, where it can lodge and grow into a ball of bacteria and move into other organs like your lungs and your brain. The needle can be iconic for danger, but what you do in order to get these drugs can be equally dangerous. For Lydia, what started as an innocuous appearing cut in her armpit ended up as a case of necrotizing fasciitis, the worst physical malady she had ever experienced in relation to her drug use. But even before her illness, Lydia had existed in a kind of nether zone, a death in life. She had been incarcerated many times for drug use, and social institutions like the prison and the hospital often unwittingly exposed some people like her to injury and death along the moral fault lines of our society while protecting others. The so-called, quote, mad, bad, and sick are the ones who are exposed to death's reach. They include the friendless, the surly, the unpleasant, the badly behaved, and the ones whose anxious presence can come across as unbearable. Lydia had already died many deaths. She had endured the, quote, civil death wrought by being in prison, the soul-destroying experience of incarceration and solitary confinement, and the institutions in which she and many others cycled, including hospitals, jails, prisons, detox programs, 30-day treatments, often overlay death as a foreboding possibility in the lives of women who use heroin. Maybe Lydia was already dead to communities and passerbys who drove past where she was sleeping at night under a bridge. Maybe she had become dead to her family who disowned their lesbian daughter, the one who became a dope fiend and stole their television to exchange it for drugs. Maybe she had become politically dead, erased from the voting rolls while incarcerated, no one's constituent. Maybe her story had fallen on deaf ears in her community, people who felt nothing but fear seeing her in the street at night. Lydia had certainly been left for dead before. She had also left others for dead, afraid of the police finding her in a house with an unconscious heroin user if she called 911, because she was deathly afraid of being hauled off to jail herself. It's worse than death, she said to me, to be racked by sweats, shakes, and the runs of dope sickness in a 10 by 10 cell with 5 other equally sick women undergoing the unnecessary throes of forced withdrawal. No one said it would be pleasant. Living so close to death means living close to the vomit, diarrhea, and the mucus of your body in violent revolt. So I tell kind of the story in that chapter really of, Lydia's struggle. And as she bounced back and forth between hospital, using, I myself had intervened, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, really as a medical student to try, I felt it was morally like a moral imperative almost for me to try to figure out how to ease her suffering, as I was both an ethnographer and anthropologist, but also had access to all this social capital at Harvard. And, I write about it in the book, going to court with her. And, she really wanted these pictures of her necrotizing fasciitis. And the fact that I presented to court with her and was like, I'm from Harvard Medical School. They're like, okay, we won't send you to jail. But like, no one else has that, and so it was actually really, and I try to write about her story in a way to illustrate, this structural violence and the ways in which, sort of engaged anthropology, what it can look like and what it means. But obviously it definitely can be tricky. And, we never necessarily get a chance to teach that. We never necessarily get a chance to talk about sort of the nuances of that. So I look forward to the conversation and I'll hand it off.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm so grateful that people are here, that we're doing this cafe. And I'm just, I'm so in love with this book series, and I have been for a long time, and I never quite imagined, it just never even occurred to me to think of myself as, hey, I could join that team. So it's so fun to sit here with all of you fabulous people. So I'm another physician anthropologist, and I'll actually start my story there. because in my training, I started with the medical side of my training, and somewhat to my surprise, I fell in love with taking care of people as they were dying. And it fell on me as I was moving into my anthropological training that it might make sense to figure out why I had fallen in love with that, because it was something that seemed, a little bit outside of medical epistemology or outside of even the ethics of medicine, that there was something about it that lured me, that really brought me into a kind of engagement and connection with people that felt like it was beyond or outside of medicine. And I think part of what it was that there's this feeling as people are approaching a crisis or a shift in their ontological state, in their actual nature of being as big as dying, that was extremely vulnerable and cut through all of this noise that seemed like it was characterized a lot of medicine. And people were often really alone and having trouble making sense of what was going on. And there was a need to step in and hold space for that. And then the connections that came out of that and the experiences that came out of that were really great for me. So I want to pause for a moment and have you hear all of these tropes of Western medicine that I'm saying here that I thought were really unique to me, about the, the religious savior who steps in at the, the moment of crisis of meaning and helps people find, anyway, I won't go on a digression about the Catholic deathbed in the late medieval period, but anyway. So part of what I began to wonder was this instinct that I had that there was something universal and connected about dying. And instead of just assuming that, I started to take it as a question, an anthropological question. Where did that assumption come from, and how does it vary around the world? And I started to think, okay, what happens if I move my experiences in this biomedical dying environment in the United States and I move it somewhere else to see how it's modified? And we are accustomed to thinking of medicine, biomedicine, allopathic Western medicine, I'll just call it medicine from here on out, as this kind of separate and contained philosophical and knowledge system that moves around the globe relatively untouched and intact, so that if you were to parachute into a hospital somewhere in India, you would imagine, okay, you've walked into these walls and now things are going to be secular and people are walking around with reductionist, materialist, mechanistic models in their brains, and they're providing a service commodity, and there are all these biopolitical things they're doing, like focusing on mortality reduction as the thing that matters most. And they're delivering kind of mostly anonymous care as they plug people into protocols and algorithms, and they're thinking statistically about public health, et cetera. That's my little crash narrative about medicine as a system. So what I began to find as I looked around is that, particularly around the end of life, but in many areas in medicine, we're starting to map out in anthropology the fact that that is not how medicine is. And in fact, it actually is the site of all of these really interesting, complicated hybrids where medicine gets repurposed into other systems and ways of experiencing the world. And so the question that motivated my book was, this thing that felt so universal to me, how is it experienced and lived in spaces that are medically very different, that are hybrids of all these different systems? And so the book is, it's about the globalization of medicine, but it's really about sort of the global conversations about whether there is such a thing as universal human experience or not. And in order to do that, what I look at is, how has the end of life, how has the process of dying changed in Thailand? The book takes place in Thailand, as Thailand has hyper technologized. So Thailand has a universal healthcare system. Everybody has access to hospital medicine if they need it at the end of life. They have this public health system that is sort of the admiration of the world. Right now, we're seeing that in COVID, because Thailand is the country basically that has done the best anywhere, and it's because of their fabulous public health system. So in a place that has really taken Western biomedicine and allopathic medicine on, how does the end of life look as it mixes with other things? So as a quick summary of how the end of life is experienced in Thailand, I'll give a quick summary of a bunch of the book before I take you into a passage. So one is that children owe their parents a debt of life for having been given a body at birth. And unlike a lot of sort of filial piety systems around Asia and around the world, it's a very physical debt. So people think of themselves as actually owing body parts back to their elders for having been given a physical body. And the ICU in the hospital has become the best place to pay back that debt, the place that's supercharged. So ICU care has become this national imaginary. It shows up in soap operas and novels, and people, lots of scenes in fiction show up in the ICU because it's this example of how sort of high tech and advanced Thailand is becoming. But it's also this place where there's lots of conflicts with these other ways of formulating, approaching the end of life. And one of those is this debt of life, which now takes place in the ICU. So people that I was taking care of in the ICU would say, you know, we know there's no hope of our elder living through this, but the IV medications are giving them blood, which is an important part of the body, and the endotracheal tube and the mechanical ventilator are giving them breath, and we are here and we're paying back this debt of life. So at the same time, the hospital is a terrible place to die. And it's a terrible place to die because it is morally and metaphysically polluted, because bad deaths generate unhappy spirits that have unfinished business with the living and who linger to work out those old issues with the living. So there's this kind of clinginess and stickiness of spirits that live in the hospital that are generated. So you can hear, I'm now just narrating about this place, but you can hear this kind of creolization of medicine. That is, we're using the ICU to save people's lives, but we're also using it to pay back debts of life. But then that has caused this new problem of all these horrible deaths that we've created that are generating these sticky spirits. So if the hospital is a great place for paying back a debt of life, but a bad place to die, it generates something called the spirit ambulance, which is the title of the book, which is this rush first to get people to the hospital to pay back this debt in the ICU. And then before it is too late and they're at risk of dying in the hospital, to rush them home so that their last breath will take place in the right place. In the book, I start by telling that whole system, and then I get into other things that are starting to arrive into this whole system. A series of political events. I don't know if there are any Thai, I was looking at the attendees to see if there are any Thai studies scholars, so I'll avoid a geek digression into Thai politics. But Thai politics is very complicated, and at the heart of it is this debate between autocratic paternalism, i.e. royalty and the military, versus individual autonomous decision-making, i.e. democracy. And a famous monk died in the middle of this and had a problematic death where he went into the ICU and was there for a long time. And people started importing debates about human rights and electoral politics and mixed it with end of life, so that there's this huge movement to advocate for people knowing their diagnosis, making their own decisions at the end of life, and doing away with the spirit ambulance altogether, not as its own intervention into end of life necessarily, but as a way to teach people how to be democratic subjects and have their own decision-making over their bodies. Okay, so that whole landscape is a way of talking about this distinction between, in what ways is this a universal life experience that seemed to me like it connects me in a really familiar way to people? And then how do we make sense of this very complicated hybrid complexity of medicine and Buddhist spirituality and ghosts in the hospital? And I don't know that I come up with a great answer overall in the book, but that is the motive that made me do the field work. So I thought I would read a passage for you. This is actually the opening of the book. And Eva, I'm wondering how much time I have. I think I have enough time to read a passage, right? Okay, good. So this is the opening of the book. It's called Jandi, the Spirit Ambulance. "We have to make it home," said Jundi's son, who sat across from me as I pumped oxygen into his mother's lungs to keep her spirit attached to her body. We were seated in the cab of an old pickup truck outfitted as an ambulance. Jundi lay unconscious on a mattress, a blood-filled endotracheal tube emerging from her mouth, connected by a balloon pump in my hand to an oxygen tank at the front of the cab. We struggled to stabilize ourselves as the truck tossed from side to side, winding its way into northern Thailand's mountain jungle. Rice fields passed us out of mist, punctuated by flames from fires set to prime the forest soil for mushroom growing in the coming monsoon season. The smoky air was interrupted periodically by scents of pine and mist, and in a quiet stretch of the road, I could hear the gurgling sound of blood in Jandi's endotracheal tube. I had met Jandi several days before in the hot season of 2008 when she arrived at Nakhon Ping Hospital in Chiang Mai, the capital of northern Thailand, where I was engaged in field work. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Jandi had resisted her family's attempts to take her to the hospital for a long time. And part of that was that she didn't want to tax the family resources of time and money in order to essentially let them pay back this debt of life. And they were always trying to get her to go, and she refused. And then one day she collapsed in her house in northern Thailand and was unconscious. And so they swept her to the hospital, which was a 5.5-hour drive through the mountains back to the main city where I was. And when she got there, chest imaging showed that her lungs were full of fluid of some kind. And the doctors thought she either had cancer or tuberculosis, and her lungs were full of blood. And it was pretty much too late to reverse either of those processes and save her life. And so I met the family there while they were waiting to hear what would happen. And the doctors eventually came and said, we think that there's no way to save her. And also she's at risk of dying really soon. It's time to go. So I was sitting with the family when this pronouncement was made. And Jandi's daughter turned to me and suddenly asked fiercely, would you help us? We need to take mother home. And I hadn't traveled home before, I'm reading again now, with a patient like this, but I knew that we would probably be attempting to have Jandi's last breath take place in the right location. And this was because of the spirits in the hospital and because of how good a place home is to die. When are we leaving? I asked Jandi's daughter. We're waiting for the ambulance to be prepared, she said. Ambulance? I thought, surprised. And then I realized that Jandi was on a mechanical ventilator pumping oxygen into her blood-filled lungs. If we were going to get her home for her last breath, we would have to take over the machine and pump her lungs the entire way. The head of the surgical ward pulled me aside and asked me in a whisper, have you ever removed an endotracheal tube before? I said no, suspecting where this was going. Here's how, she said, and pulled a plastic tube out of the cupboard to show me how to deflate the balloon that held it in place. As the most medical person around, you'll have to withdraw it. I tried throughout my fieldwork to explain that I was just a medical student, but that distinction doesn't exist in Thailand. So I was confused since many nurses and physicians I'd interviewed in the hospital considered withdrawal of life support unethical because it was active euthanasia. This included Jandi's physician, Dr. Brani. The breath, many explained, is the last element to separate from the body. And so pulling out an endotracheal tube feels like killing, like you're reaching into somebody's throat and pulling their breath out. In the heat of the moment, I had time only for one question. Isn't it unethical, I asked? Well, yes, the nurse replied. Dr. Brani doesn't withdraw tubes in the hospital, but it's okay at home. The patient will be at home when it is removed. Ethical at home, but not in the hospital? I felt a wave of disorientation wash over me as I tried to make sense of this, but there was no time to clarify. We were then swept into feverish activity. The nurses took Jandi off the mechanical ventilator and switched her to a balloon pump. And as we wheeled her down the hall to the parking lot, they showed me how to pump air into her lungs to keep her spirit attached to her body. The ambulance that had been waiting for us was a pickup truck owned by one of the hospital gate guards. You know, in hospitals in a lot of countries, there's like a person who sits at the gate and gives you information and then lets you in and out. He ran a small business on the side, taking people home to die. His truck was less expensive than a real ambulance, serving poor families like Jandi's. It was equipped with a mattress, 2 tall green oxygen tanks, and a motorcycle tire pump that he had reconfigured to administer intravenous embalming fluid in case a patient were to die on the way home. If she were to die in transit, the guard explained, the embalming fluid would help keep her spirit near her body to make sure that she could follow us home even once disembodied. Okay, I'll stop there. That the opening vignette is all about that, and I hope that I hope you notice all of the hybrids of things that are in there, and that throughout the hybrid, there's still this thing that remains, which is the intensity of the experience of choreographing a meaningful and good end of life for somebody, which is what I went there to try to sort out. Thanks, I'll end there.
I guess it's my turn. I am so thrilled to be here and want to thank Ava, Kate, everyone at the University of California Press who helped put this together, and everyone at the press who has made my experience publishing the United States of War such a pleasure. Really up and down, everyone I've worked with has been fantastic. And like Scott and perhaps everyone, I've wanted to publish in this series for a very long time. I wanted to publish with other authors who were interested in writing about critical issues of the day and wanting to make interventions in those issues. In some ways, I think it raises the question of why every series at an academic press, why every publisher for that matter, doesn't publish books exclusively that try to make interventions in critical public issues. As the three authors who preceded me clearly are doing so powerfully. So thank you to them as well. And thank you to everyone listening today. Let me share my screen real briefly. Oh, I no longer have the power to share my screen. Maybe I will regain that power. But I should say that if anyone sees me drinking from this is in the spirit of the Café. This is not Guinness, this is coffee. But let's see if, just thought some visuals could be helpful for a variety of reasons. A long series of maps are an important part of the book and an important part of making some of the arguments of the book, as I'll show you real quickly. What inspired me to write this book? As many know, the United States has now been fighting in a war for 19 consecutive years as of October 7th, earlier this month. People talk about this as the endless war or endless wars. And my fear is that the United States is going to continue to fight endless wars. And my interest in writing this book was to try to be part of a movement, a long-standing movement, to bring an end to these wars and to bring an end to a larger pattern of US war that dates to independence. Unfortunately, we hear military leaders, politicians, others talking about this current war as not just the endless war, but the long war, infinite war, a period of forever war. NBC News reporter asked the head, the four-star general commanding all the troops in the Middle East, saying, do you think it's a forever war? And General Joseph Votel responded, I don't know if it's forever war. Define forever, which of course would be funny if it weren't so serious, the consequences of these wars, which takes me to read a little passage, and then I'll share with you just a bit about the central argument of the book, point to some of what I see as alternatives to this period of forever war, of endless war, and then read something at the very, very end. But the first thing I saw when I walked into the belly of the dark gray C-17 Air Force cargo plane was a void, something missing, a missing left arm, gone, severed at the shoulder, temporarily patched and held together. All that remained was thick, pale flesh, flecked with bright red at the edges. It looked like meat sliced open. The face and what remained of the man were obscured by bandages, blankets, a US flag quilt, and a jumble of tubes and syringes, drip bags, wires, and medical monitors. A tattoo on the soldier's surviving arm read, "Death before dishonor." That man and two other critically wounded soldiers, one with two stumps where legs had been, the other missing a leg below the thigh, were intubated, unconscious, and lying on litters hooked to the walls of the plane that had just landed at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. It was June 2012. A fourth critically injured man was sitting motionless, holding his head in his hands. Sorry. Outside the plane, 2 converted school bus ambulances were ready to transport the men to the Army's Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, 20 minutes away. Their babies, Lorraine and Norbert, a German civilian working at Ramstein Air Base, said to me, "It could be my baby," she said, thinking of her high school aged daughter. "I've seen some crazy stuff," she said, patients with no arms, no legs, just torso, burned patients. "It puts my life in perspective," she said. "Americans, they don't see the impact." I'm sure many of you have seen the impact of these wars that the United States has been waging since 2001, 19 consecutive years, combat troops deployed to 24 countries at least, around 15,000 deaths of US military personnel and US military contractors. The number of dead, of course, in the countries where the United States has been fighting is much, much larger. In just the five of the countries where the US has been fighting, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, the death toll is more than 50 times as high, somewhere around 800,000 combat deaths. The actual total death toll is probably somewhere between 3 to 4 million, including indirect deaths, people who've died outside the direct combat, and the total could actually be much higher. 37 million people displaced as refugees and internally displaced people in the 8 most violent wars the United States has been fighting in addition to the 5 I previously mentioned, also Somalia, Libya, and the Philippines. And what has this cost the United States? What does this cost all of us who've been paying US taxes? $6.4 trillion, that's trillion with a T, $6.4 trillion, which is a very difficult sum to wrap one's mind around, including because of what that money wasn't spent on. This period of war, this period of 19 consecutive years of war, is not an aberration, as I show in my book, The United States of War. This is a map in the book depicting wars the United States government has been involved in and other forms of combat. This is a list. One of the many exciting things that were exciting to me as, I don't know, a book nerd or something, was that the press was able to print this list of all the wars and other combat the US military has been involved in since independence on the end sheets in the inside cover and inside back cover. I'll just read a few real quickly. Shawnee, these are peoples and countries in which US military and other parts of the US government have fought since 1776. Shawnee, Delaware, Cherokee, Muskogee, Canada, Tripoli, Seminole, Peru, Greece, Apache, Mexico, Hawaii, Cuba, Philippines, Honduras, Panama, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Afghanistan, Colombia, Iraq. And many of these that I mentioned actually have been either invaded or the site of US war on multiple occasions, 24 cases in the case of Panama, for example. Maps, again, are helpful, I think, in making the central argument of the book, which that, well, the question, that I raise, or I think that this pattern of war, pattern in which the United States military has been fighting in all but 11 years of US history, 95% of the years in US history, the US military has been at war or in some other form of combat in more than 135 foreign lands. The question, of course, is why? And in the book, I argue that US military bases abroad help explain why. They're not the only explanation, but they provide a key, something of a window or a lens to understand why. This is a map depicting the current collection of around 800 US bases outside the 50 states in Washington, DC, in around 80 foreign countries and colonies and territories. Maps beginning with 1776 show how US bases abroad, how the construction of a large system of US bases abroad has since independence helped expand US borders across North America and then eventually around the world. So you see over time, the maps show both US wars and the bases that have helped enable the wars. The argument in the book is that US bases abroad have not just enabled US wars and other forms of combat, they haven't just made those wars possible, they've actually made war more likely. They've made war more likely, and they've helped create what's effectively a self-perpetuating system of permanent war. Now, again, bases alone don't explain why the United States has been fighting so consistently and continually. The book explains that bases in tandem with capitalist profit-making desires, in tandem with the political interests of politicians, racism, gender, and specifically a kind of masculinity, socially constructed idea of masculinity tied to displays of violence, missionary Christianity and nationalism also help explain why the United States has become a United States of war, why the United States is more properly than most maps represented, I think, by this map, which includes the colonies, current colonies, and US military bases abroad. In short, the argument is that the United States is a United States of war. This isn't just a metaphor or hyperbole. The United States and US citizens and anyone living in the United States, as well as many other parts of the world, has had their lives profoundly shaped by this history of war in many, many ways. Let me quickly look at the time and see if I can, do I have a minute or, yeah? Okay. Just quickly, I want to share some of the ideas that I present in the book, because again, my aim is not just to diagnose the problem, explain the problem, but to present ideas for changing the current state of war. And part of the argument is that this pattern of war is not inevitable. This was due to choices of elites, in particular, wealthy, white, male elites, for the most part, folks who, of course, sort of look like me. This is sort of some broad categories of alternatives and ways that we, I think, need to urgently change the current pattern of war. I would just point to a few of the sort of more detailed proposals. Preventing a war with China, I think, has to be an essential priority for anyone concerned about this pattern of war. Delegitimizing war as a policy option. Cutting the military budget in half. We have a military budget totally out of proportion to the threats facing us. Moving the money from this system of war to the problems that the other authors today have illuminated. Moving the money to a healthcare system, to a public healthcare system, to universal healthcare coverage, to affordable housing, to eviction prevention, and the list goes on. Infrastructure, education, of course, schools. Conversion is one specific proposal I discuss. Closing military bases abroad and building up our diplomatic presence. Reckoning, repairing, beginning some processes of reconciliation with the people that the United States has fought wars with or others, as well as democratizing foreign policy making, getting more people involved in foreign policy making. So foreign policy making and decisions about war aren't just made by people who, again, have tended to look like me on the whole since 1776. Let me turn things over. I hope we have some time because the issues that have been put on the table are fantastic by the other authors. So apologies if I went on too long.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's never, the time always seems to run faster when we are listening to such interesting presentations. So we do have some time for questions, and I think if you don't want to type them, it is also okay for the attendees to raise a hand and I can give you permission to speak. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And as you're thinking about the question, I want to remind everyone who is attending and who is watching live on Facebook that attendees can get these great books and read more. You already got a taste of what's in them, but really read the whole story from the University of California Press website. And there is a 30% discount code, which is 17M as in Mary 6662. So if you don't have these books yet, there is a good opportunity to get them. And I'm really interested to hear whether anyone has any questions or comments to any of the panelists or to all panelists together. We are here. Okay, so we got a question for Scott. And I can read it to you. So I was wondering regarding a certain right timing that the spirit ambulance has to meet, whether it is in arriving on time at the hospital or on its way back to the home. What happens when these divergent temporalities don't meet and the timing of this up and down movement fails? Would this be a case of failing to achieve a good death, or would there be other ways to recreate the narrative of a good death, and which elements then become prominent in such negotiations?
Yeah, great question. So the subtitle of the book is Choreographing the End of Life. So you just hit it right on the head that this is all about, it's about space, it's about time, and the whole thing is this really complicated dance. And part of why I used choreography as a metaphor is because the thing that I shouldn't have been surprised by, because I should have read my social theory deeper before the field, but was how much improvisation and creativity and negotiation, you use that word, how much of all those there was in this process. So as you can imagine, there we are, we're bag ventilating a patient on the way home and they die on the way. And then we have to stop and improvise basically to get them home. And all of sort of the conceptual underpinning of it is just there and, sort of embroiled all the time in driving people to know what to do next. So if somebody died on the way, we would stop and instead of driving like 20 kilometers an hour over the speed limit to rush home, we would suddenly drive really slowly, and family members would all crowd into the back of the truck and talk the spirit into sticking with the body and saying, we're passing the 7-Eleven where you bought your cigarettes, and we're passing the place you used to play soccer as a kid, and please stick with us. And then they would say loving things to make the spirit want to stay attached to the body. So, the only thing in your question that I'll say is that there's almost like there's this idea of a totally right way of doing it that then could fall apart and totally dissolve. But instead, it's all improv all the time. There's no such thing as a perfect way this goes. So that also gives this kind of a little bit of a sense of freedom, in that as long as everybody's trying really hard, then it's pretty much always interpreted as a good death. Now, I use the word always, but I shouldn't have, because there are some really big problems that come up. For example, we're now keeping people alive longer than their body would ever have stayed alive. So they are alive beyond death. And then we take them off life support, and all the fentanyl and Versed, the pain meds and the general anesthesia that was sedating them in their blood wears off, and they wake up in rip-roaring, horrifying pain at the end of life, and you're suddenly wish you had a full ICU, and there you are in somebody's living room with nothing but the endotracheal tube you just pulled out, right? So sometimes things crashed and burned and went horribly wrong, and then everybody completely freaked out. Where it was like a physiologic, experiential, metaphysical disaster. So that certainly happened. So there were definitely, there are, you know, the premise of a good death is that a bad death is definitely possible. Otherwise, there aren't criteria at work that everybody's trying to work toward. Natasha, I don't know if that answered your question.
Thank you, Scott. As we're waiting for more questions, I think I would like to ask something of all the panelists. You wrote these really impactful books that make us reconsider some of the things that maybe we take for granted, whether it is death or housing or war or addiction. But you're also in various ways, you're authors, but you also are in various other ways engaged in looking for solutions to these issues, whether you are practicing medicine, whether you are activist, whether you're teaching. And I wonder how you see these two roles that you play as public anthropologists. As what role does a book play in your, or how do you reconcile these two roles of being an active citizen and also a writer? And how does writing a book help you do what you couldn't do otherwise to shed light on these important issues? And I don't know, anyone can go first.
Can I just add to that question, Yeva? I was going to say that my question for you all, and thinking about the tremendous history of the series, which I've only started to become involved with in the last few years, but where do you think anthropology can have the greatest impact outside of the field? And how is the book part of the vehicle for launching that impact?
I already talked, actually, so if somebody else wants to, that's probably better.
Yeah, Kim or Noelle. I can jump in. Maybe we could go in reverse, or it's not quite reverse order, but anyway, I think, I think anthropology, I think all social sciences, I think the sciences should be focused on impact outside of their own fields. I think, you know, the part of why this series is so important is that it helped move anthropology and anthropologists from just speaking to one another. And, you know, that's why I've written this book primarily for people outside of anthropology, for a wide public audience. And personally, I guess I don't see there being a distinction between different roles in my life particularly, and see this book as an expression of, I don't know, what I want to try to do in the world. I do think books, specifically, and writing more broadly, can be important tools for social change. If I didn't think so, I wouldn't have written this book. I think we do need to do a lot of work beyond just sort of putting a book out into the world and then hoping for the best. So I see the book as a tool that has to be part of larger social movements. It has to make contributions to those movements, and has to be, in my own life, has to be a tool that I'm using with other tools to hopefully make some contribution to, in my case, bringing an end to this pattern of war and making the world a bit more peaceful.
Yeah, I really agree with what David said. I think it's, a perfect articulation of why the series is so important. I think, to be totally frank, for me, one of the struggles, I do think that there's a difference. There is a kind of disjunct between being an anthropologist and being an activist. There still is a separation for me. And I think it comes from, part of it is anthropology's engagement with the world, and part of it is just, we're so practiced at observing and analyzing and diagnosing, but making recommendations for concrete policy solutions, for instance, totally out of my totally out of my lane. And so this idea, I was excited when David put up here's what we should do. And it was like, oh my goodness, go for it. Like, that's what we need, more practice with that, because we are definitely not trained to do that. In fact, I think we're trained not to do that, not to kind of stake a claim and say, this is the answer, this is the solution, but we can spend years really diagnosing the problem. So far, I mean, I've been an activist in many other arenas, and including in housing, but I haven't necessarily taken my research and developed a policy solution based on that research. Instead, it's more offering it to people who are making the decisions and who would be in a position to have some power, but not necessarily have all the information or the time to spend time, you know, with families or with bank employees or whatever it might be. So I think that there is still a separation or a tension, and it's a fruitful discussion to figure out whether or not that's something that we should move into as public anthropologists. Should we be making more policy recommendations, or is our role really as a kind of advisor to folks who are in those positions? It's such a great question.
Yeah, I mean, it was great to see recommendations, and I get asked for, you know, I'm sure all of us, as you write a book, you get asked kind of like, then what, you know, and like, so what? Um, and what's been actually really interesting for me is I think there's just a generation of people coming up where they don't necessarily see the scholarship as being that, you know, so many that separator, you know, it's very diffuse, I think, for a lot of people. And I've been approached by so many people, you know, just find me online and they're like, I just want to be like an anthropologist and a nurse, or, you know, or like I want to be a midwife and an you know, like, and I'm so inspired by the way that people are seeing the way that you can use the tools of anthropology and ethnography to, you know, make meaningful change. And, you know, hopefully our books can inspire people that way. And, you know, a couple things that people have said to me about my book. One is they used it to like give to their local sheriffs and district attorneys. That's amazing. You know what I mean? Like, that was like, I was like, wow, like that's like where people of the 3,000 jails in this country are making life and death decisions and have no expertise, right? Other things are people like, oh, my methadone clinic read your book and it like really speaks to like junkie epistemology and stuff, or, you know, like our life. And like, there's something to be said, I think, for witnessing and validating people. The third thing that I was thinking about, though, is as I've moved into these realms where I do policy and I do advocacy, is like, how do I decenter myself and like, you know what I mean? Like, especially physicians, like medical humanities, we're like telling people stories, and I'm like, wow, it's actually like, I think things are really shifting where it's like, oh, like what value do I bring in this particular way? But like, why am I not equipping people with the power and the resources and the education to write their own book? And so many people that I worked with were like, I want to write a book living in so much structural violence. Like, why couldn't I have envisioned that book, you know? And like, what is my next book? Could it be that kind of like collaboration? And, you know, so I think that those are important things that I've been grappling with, thinking about decentering. You know, I was like, oh, initially, like when I wanted to be a physician and practice social medicine, it was really like, oh, I can use this to like leverage for the most vulnerable, structurally oppressed. And now I'm like, well, they actually have quite strident voices and, you know, really articulate already. So like, what is like, do I need to tell people stories, and what story can I tell about, you know, like Scott spoke about, just these, you know, incredibly, you know, tragic things that, you know, he was asked to do and witness as the medical student, or, you know, enact. And so like, what is our story? And, you know, I think that, and we're actually, like, I think David references as well, you know, like people who look like me, right? Where do we, like, you know, like what, you know, what do our books add to this? And then also, where can we step back, and like, whose advocacy can we promote?
I guess maybe I was invoked as us going in reverse order, so maybe I'll say a little bit. So I'll be brief about it, but I think the main thing I'll say is that I don't want to ding other disciplines here, but one great thing about anthropology is that we're really good at getting into it, into the weeds, like getting ourselves into the thick of really complicated, real, moving, finely grained stuff. And, you know, that's not just true. Kim and I were talking about our training as doctors and it being kind of helpful for the anthropology, but it's really just true of what we do. The whole idea of deep hanging out and going and spending enough time with people with the ethic of looking for them to kick our butts and tell us that we're wrong and how we understand things. As a method, as an ethnographic method, it's like it's already an intervention when you then share that view with the world. So Noelle, you know, you were talking about your activist, like I was hearing activist and policy recommendation just dripping out of the story as you were telling it by how you told the story. Like there's no way to listen to that story and not be so angry at the banks and at the people who decided that the banks that caused the problem should be the ones who should continue to cause the problem by pretending to do the solution. I mean, just the way you tell the story is already building policy through, it's not even just rhetoric, it's through like an embroilment with the emotive space in which people are actually living the stuff that we're looking at.
David.
Could I just pick up on that just real briefly, because I think Noelle and Kim too, I think, you know, I wouldn't, and anthropologists generally, social scientists, we shouldn't sell ourselves short when it comes to policy solutions. And one very simple one that I think my work points to is the importance of inter-issue organizing, and in specifically moving the money from this war system, from, you know, the military budgets in excess of $740 billion a year, to make housing a human right, to eviction prevention, to drug treatment, to public health, to healthcare, et cetera. Anyway.
Noelle, were you going to say something too?
Sure. Yeah, no, I just, thank you so much, Scott. That's a really wonderful and thoughtful response. And I think that, but I have had this sensation of suddenly when you are in the room with power brokers and they say, okay, great, what should we do? You know, when they're really looking for a kind of programmatic response, it does feel like I'm wading into territory that I shouldn't be in, perhaps. It's much harder to come up with a really specific policy proposal based on the research. I agree that my job is, I'm here as a storyteller. I'm here to present an analysis that helps people to see the interconnectedness, as David mentioned. But then when people want really concrete, practical solutions, it is much harder. And so maybe, you know, and maybe that's something that we shouldn't be getting into. Maybe that's not our forte, and we should leave that to others. And our job is really to just share these stories and to allow people to come to their own conclusions, which is something I feel much more comfortable with. But yeah, so thank you though. I agree. I think there is definitely power just in the work that we're doing as a kind of intervention.
Well, great. Thank you, everyone. I agree with you on so many points. And I think there are different projects and also different organizations and different times in our lives and stages in our careers when we can do one thing more than the other. But first of all, we're all anthropologists and we write books and books are important. So we almost have, our time is almost up, unless somebody has any final comments. It was really great to have you all here and hear you read from your books. And I hope you have a good evening.
Actually, one question. Sorry to delay but I'm just curious to see, are people writing about the current moment yet? How are you thinking about, I mean, especially for the medical anthropologists, or, how do you think about COVID and an analysis? And are you working on projects that speak to this incredible chaotic time that we're all in, or is it, how are you feeling about that? I'm just really curious. And also maybe if things are going on in the press, if you're thinking about how to, tell this story that we're living through now, and if there are books coming out in that vein. I'm curious how we're approaching it.
I can tell you people are pitching already, and sometimes it feels a little like, how can you know yet? But who's going to write the great big book on COVID? That remains to be seen. But I think a lot of people are having to update their books, and people who are just entering production, who are right on contemporary issues, are needing to add material to sort of address the present moment. But I want to hear from the panelists.
So I've been reading stuff that Kim's been writing on COVID. So Kim, can I can I call it somatosphere and things like that? I'd love to hear your thoughts about what that's been like.
It's honestly been such a blur that I forgot I wrote that piece on somatosphere. Honestly, I have a lot of ideas. And yeah, Scott is talking about a piece that Nick Iacobelli, a physician anthropologist, and I, based in Seattle, and I wrote about really, kind of some quick field notes based on New York City and Seattle in March and April, when things were really just emergent. And I told Eugene Reichel, I was like, I have a lot of thoughts about, Nick and I kind of want to write this brief piece, just thinking about, what's going on. It would be almost every month there was like another update to that. And I was working in a field hospital in the Tennis Center in Billie Jean King in New York City, which was, I mean, I don't like completely like, as an anthropologist, like I wasn't even able to write field notes really about that experience. It was so overwhelming. I was also in Rikers a little bit when COVID was happening. And so I was also answering 311 for New York City when COVID was happening. People were like, I don't know what to do. I was like, we don't have any tests. But I did take some field notes in my shifts in jail, and so I'm trying. And also I was emergency credentialed at a methadone clinic, a disaster credentialed, because people in the healthcare system died. So I also started taking field notes from that, providing addiction care in this really, chaotic space. So I haven't written, I think it's also hard as a person to like, I feel so depleted as a physician. This year has been, and I think all of us are just trying to get by, and everyone's like, how are you? Hope you're hanging in, because it's no longer, how are you is such a fraught question. So I think right now I'm trying to balance and thinking about the ways that, writing can be a balm, but also it can also be a chore, and like what our capacity is to be here for this moment. So hopefully we're all taking notes on our experiences, because I think it's affected all of us in this way that's so unbelievable and it's unprecedented.
I wanted to add one quick thing, actually in response to something you said, Kate, about how can you know yet? And I want to push back against that a little bit. Because I'm doing it. I was working in a hospital during the surge, and I've been doing a project around it. And while I was doing it, I had this doubt, like, okay, clearly in 3 months we're going to know so much about this thing, and everything that I'm worried about right now is going to seem so trite. And all the social forces that I'm observing, people are going to have like worked out in great detail about all the structural racism and all of that, everything that I was observing on the ground is going to just seem so, I mean, it's even in the popular news media. And then recently, like going back into all my field notes from the time, I've realized that all of that still matters for what we thought and what we knew at that time. So when it was new, knowing about what it was like to have it be new is relevant and accurate and real, like the confusion and the total chaos, like in the medical system, how, you know, I'm like getting texts from friends in other cities, like try this on your patients. And that's how I'm deciding what to do medically. Like that's never going to happen again. That feels like ancient history and very foreign. And so I think that, you know, that there's this thing that anthropologists are really trained well at, which is how do you live in a present moment and show like what mattered and what showed up and what was available in that moment. And then how do you zoom out to the history that produced it and to the things we now know in retrospect, that sort of the diachronic, synchronic back and forth is something that will always be powerful. So if you guys are looking for book, not my book, but if you are looking for books, pay attention to the, like, people now I think will probably be able to write about early COVID very lucidly as early COVID.
That's a really good point. Thank you.
Even though we have no idea where, you know, we have no idea how, if it's going to be, we have no idea when late COVID will occur. Are we in mid COVID? Or, I mean, there's so much that's still unclear.
I have to say, just in terms of the present moment, you know, I have found, you know, the work of doctors like you, Scott and Kim, and other healthcare professionals extraordinarily inspiring. And I think there are many reasons to be really optimistic and inspired at a moment that is also tremendously sad and painful. But, you know, in addition to the sort of the work that healthcare professionals are doing, you know, all the mutual aid efforts that have sprung up around COVID, in addition to the, you know, the largest protest movement in US history in the form of the Black Lives Matter protests, coupled with, you know, I think anti-war protests have been successful in the long term in turning the majority of the country against war. And you see that in polling. In addition to the Bernie movement, in addition to you know, the young people who are organizing around climate change and gun violence. So I think this is really an unprecedented moment that, to bring it back to COVID, you know, I think we also have an opportunity to make the kinds of structural change that I think we've all wanted to see for a long time, but that is now possible in ways that were simply impossible to even conceive of prior to COVID.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm sorry I was trying to cut you off too early. This really has been a very illuminating hour. And thank you to the panelists and to the audience. I hope we'll meet you at the next edition of the New Books Cafe in Public Anthropology next year.
May it be in person, I hope.
I hope so too.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's really
Thank
wonderful.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Vote.